Now let's talk about processing images. And I'm not actually going to process these because they're all so similar and all that. We might come back to them at some point, but in general, I'm going to work with a different set of images. Now, instead of having a shoot on the beach, because I'm sure you're sick of looking at those, we're going to Iceland. So all I've done here is I have a collection of images that need processing. And let's jump in and process them. So I'm going to click on an image, and if this is a RAW file, meaning my camera was set to capture in RAW file format instead of JPEG, then all I need to do is double click on the image and it will open it in a special dialog box that's called Camera Raw. If, on the other hand, I have my camera set to shoot JPEGs, or these are TIFF files or another file format other than RAW, then when you double click on them, it would just open the image in Photoshop without first sending you to this thing called Camera Raw. And if that was the case, I could go to the File menu, and there's a choice here called Open in Camera Raw. Camera Raw is an optional, in some ways, pre-processing step before you actually open the image all the way into Photoshop. But I find that a huge number of my images, all they need is this one step called Camera Raw to get them from shot to finished. And that would be my ideal situation if I could just finish everything in RAW. So in this case, these are RAW files. And so I'm going to double click on one and it's going to open it in Camera Raw. Just remember, if you had a JPEG or a TIFF file, you go to the File menu and choose Open in Camera Raw. The one exception when this is grayed out is if you have a file that has layers in it. Like you've typed text on it and the text is on a separate layer, then this will be grayed out oftentimes because I don't think it can work with files that contain layers. But I'm going to double click on that. And when I do, this is Camera Raw. This is where we're going to do a lot of processing. But first, we have a question.
When you do a photo shoot, do you most often shoot in the RAW format or
Yes.
at what point would you choose JPEG or TIFF versus RAW?
In general, when I'm out shooting, and this is for me personally, I'm not saying everyone else that's out there should be the same, but I shoot 99% of the time in RAW format. And let me just briefly tell you why, the general reasons. The JPEG file format is mainly there for convenience of a few things. First off, it gives you a smaller file because it wants to do any processing, any improvement of the image in the camera itself. And if you look at the menu system for your camera, you're going to find settings for contrast, saturation, sharpness, and all those things. Those settings only apply to JPEG files because JPEG files are processed in your camera, where hopefully when you pull the card out of your camera, you can hand it to a client because images are done. And because of that, it doesn't need to save as much information because if all the processing is already done, all you need is enough information so you could print this file and show it to people. Well, if you want to do processing on your image, let's say that you have an image, let me close this one, that looks like this one. If all it does is save enough information to print the image and enough to view it on screen, I would actually like it to save as much information as the camera is capable of capturing, even if that's more information than my printer is capable of really dealing with, because I need to be able to get as much out of that image as I possibly can. Does that make sense? That if there's any extra info, I want it on an image like this one. And so the RAW file format grabs the raw data off your camera's sensor without changing it and just says, let's save everything that camera captured. And the processing is done when you open the pictures. And that's why when you double click on a RAW file, it opens Camera Raw. It says, hey, this image hasn't been processed yet. You need to process it. And now it's giving you the equivalent to the settings you could find in your camera. Contrast, saturation, sharpness, all that kind of stuff. But you can look at the picture and decide that for this picture, you're going to use different settings for the others. Whereas with JPEG, you already picked the settings. They're already being applied every time you hit the shutter, and you better hope they're pretty good for those images because some things are being baked in, you could say, permanently applied. And it's not saving everything your camera captured, so you're only going to get so much of that information to be able to adjust. So some of the advantages of the RAW file format is that if the JPEG file format would make anything look solid white, let's say in this water, the area in the middle is solid white in a JPEG file. It's done processing it and it threw away anything extra. And so we're stuck with it being white. With a raw file, it might look white to begin with, but the camera might have captured just a little bit more information in there that it just decided not to render as detail. It decided to make it look white. And if it's a raw file, we can get back that detail. We can bring detail in here, whereas in a JPEG it'd be solid white, there'd be nothing we could do about getting it back. Same is true for the shadows. If this area in a JPEG file would be solid black, nothing you can do about it. There's no detail that was in that file that was stored to extract from there. It's a solid black area. But with a raw file, it might look like it's solid black, and if you printed it, it might be solid black. But if there was any information your camera captured in there, it's still in the file, and we can get it out. And so you're going to be able to get more highlight detail and more shadow detail out of a raw file. And the final thing about a raw file is color changes. If the color in your image is way off, you can easily color correct a raw file, and it maintains its quality. Whereas a JPEG file, since it discards anything that was extra, any extra info, you got just enough to print, just enough to show what you got, doing any kind of color correction makes it actually a little more difficult, and the quality of the end result doesn't look as good. So for me personally, it's an extra step to have to process the images and move sliders around to make them look good, but raw files capture more info, they're more versatile, so that's what I shoot. The time that I switch to JPEG is when the card in my camera is full and I want to keep shooting. Well, JPEG files are smaller. I can probably fit a few more on the card even after it thinks it's full. Or I'm going to shoot these images and I'm instantly going to give the card to the client. They don't know Photoshop. They're just going to take what's there. So I need to give it to them in a file format where it's done. And JPEG is a standard file format. Anybody can open a JPEG. But not everybody can open a RAW file. You need Photoshop or Lightroom or some other specialized tool to open it. And so I'm not going to give those images to a client until I'm done processing them. I'll give them to them as a JPEG or some other thing. Does that make any sense? But I'm not saying you guys should always shoot JPEG. Shoot whatever you're comfortable with. Shoot whatever you have good reason to. But with RAW, since I can get extra highlight detail, extra shadow detail by moving sliders, and I can more easily color correct where the end result looks better, it makes sense to me to shoot it. But if you find it gets in your way and stuff, you know, shoot what makes you get good pictures. And I just think RAW is good. So I'm going to double click on this. That opens it in Camera Raw. Remember, if you had a JPEG or a TIFF, it wouldn't open this automatically because that file format would be considered already processed. So you can just open it in Photoshop. And so you'd have to go to the File menu in Bridge and so open in Camera Raw to kind of force your picture into Camera Raw. When they first came out with Camera Raw, it would only work with RAW files. But then they figured that these adjustments are really good. And so why limit it to just RAW files? Let's make it work with JPEGs and TIFFs if people want it to. But you have to kind of force it in by using the menu. All right, now when I open good-looking images, you can move the sliders a little bit and make them look a little bit better, but it's not too exciting. And it's not as easy to learn what all the sliders do because the picture itself looks okay to begin with. So what I want to do is actually start with images that have problems. So imagine I got like a new camera or something. I didn't know how to use it. It was some mode I didn't realize it was in, and I just went out shooting with it. And I need to fix my shots, or whatever it is. Sometimes some action happens in front of you, and you have no time to react and adjust your camera. You have to pick it up and capture. So I'm going to end up working with a lot of really bad-looking images, because that's where we learn what the sliders do. And once we've learned what they do, then working on good-looking images, we can make them look a heck of a lot better, but it's easier to understand what the sliders do because you've seen them at their extremes, what they're really capable of. So first, let's do a simple thing. Remember, we're in Iceland. I went up in a plane in Iceland to shoot it from the air because it's quite beautiful both on the ground and from the air. And when I'm doing that, though, sometimes I get the plane wing in there. And so one of the first things I think about with images is I find the vast majority of images can be improved by cropping. And so one place where I can crop things is here in Camera Raw. Now in Camera Raw, at the top of your screen is a horizontal bar full of tools you could use. And then the right side of your screen are a bunch of adjustment sliders you can apply. And just so you know, those adjustment sliders, they didn't have room to show them all here. So they categorize them under all these little tabs that have these icons. So if I click on one of these, it'll change what's down below to show me different sliders. And there's a whole bunch of sliders. But we're going to start off on the upper left of my screen where we have all the tools, and I'm going to start off here with the crop tool. Now, one concept I should mention in Photoshop as a whole and in Adobe products in general is if you ever see a small triangle somewhere, it means there's more than you expect there. So when you look at these tools, do you notice that some of them have a tiny little triangle incorporated in their icons? And you're going to find the same thing if you go into Photoshop and you look at the toolbar in Photoshop. Some of the icons in the toolbar has a tiny little triangle on them, some don't. Well, that little triangle is usually an indication that there's some sort of a menu there. You could click on that thing and it will work just by clicking on it, but if you click and hold on it, you'll get more. So if I go to this tool, all there is to do is click on it. There's no click and hold. It has nothing extra because there's no triangle. But you see these two tools have triangles. So I could either click on it just to grab it generically, or I could click and hold on it, and that's where I see more. So just so you know that is in general, anywhere in Photoshop, tiny triangle somewhere, click and hold on it, there'll be more. So when I click and hold on it, right now it's set to normal, and that means that when I crop this picture, it's not going to limit how I can crop the image. I'm not limited to a square, or I'm not limited to a really horizontal thing. Whereas below that, these are various aspect ratios, where if I want a square, I could choose 1:1. And that means the width to height ratio would be 1:1, and I'd get a square. I could choose custom, and here's another convention in Photoshop. Just like the tiny little triangle means there's more there, well, if you ever see 3 periods after something, see the 3 periods? That means there are settings involved. So up here, these choices, no settings involved, meaning that choice is all of what it means. This one means it's going to ask you something once you choose it. And that's true also in Photoshop, and usually I think in Lightroom as well. In fact, that's true on anything, at least on the Mac. If there's ever 3 periods after a menu choice, there are more settings involved. Okay? So if I choose custom, it would allow me to type in a particular ratio that I want instead of using a preset. So I'm just going to leave this at its normal setting, not going to mess with it. I just wanted to introduce you guys to the concept that tiny triangle means there's more hidden there. 3 periods means there are settings involved versus no 3 periods means no settings. Okay? Now, in order to crop the image, all I'm going to do is move my mouse on top of the image. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag, and I'm going to get a rectangle. And if I let go of the mouse, it puts little handles on each corner and on the sides. And I can fine tune it by grabbing that corner. Right now I got the lower right corner, pulling on it. Or if I got it really close to being right, I could grab just the bottom edge or the right edge. But I just need to grab it where those handles are to adjust it. But in this particular case, if I try to crop the image and get rid of the plane's wing and get rid of that dark thing in the corner, whatever it was, I don't like that I'm cutting off part of this, I'll call it a lake. I don't know if that truly is a lake or not. But I don't like that I'm cutting off that. In order to get it, I would get some of the wing showing up. And I don't like the horizon is at an angle. So what I really want to do is rotate this crop. In order to rotate it, you have a couple different choices, but the main one is move away from the cropping rectangle that's here. Just move outside of it. If you move outside of it, you'll see your mouse change into something that looks like a curve. And that means you can rotate. So I'll click outside of it, drag, and right now I'm looking at the horizon line. And I'm trying to get this to somewhat align with that horizon so it feels like the horizon is straight. And then I can let go, and I can now again grab the sides or the corners and fine tune its size. And I'm just trying to get rid of this dark thing in the upper right and get rid of the wing, and then create a good composition. Now when I try to create a good composition, I usually first bring this in to get rid of whatever blatant stuff I needed to discard. Then I'll look all the way around the edge of the photo to see if there's any busy things. And if there's anything really busy right near the edge of the frame, like for instance, it might not look that busy, but do you see this little detail, this little kind of U-shaped dark spot, well, that's something that could draw my eye there. So I'll just pull it over a little bit, say right about there. Well, that's still got a little thing on the edge. I try to clean it up as much as is practical there. So here it's a big mass on the edge, big mass on the edge. Here I don't like this dark blob. I'll see if I brought it up. Could I get rid of that? No, I bump into the lake. So I'll just fine tune that. Like this little piece of snow is a thing that could distract me in the edge of the frame. Could I get rid of it? Little dark things, you know, that kind of stuff. So I just kind of try to optimize it. If you ever find that you can't do something like, I can't bring this up any higher, I want more sky, just pay attention to what's happened to the corners. Do you see the corner in the upper right is bumping into the top of the picture? You'd have to pull that to the right in order to be able to make it taller there. So you could grab that, get it up there. So anyway, do that. Then in order to see the end result, I need to get out of the crop tool. So I just switch over, and most of the time I switch to the hand tool. The hand tool is kind of a neutral tool. It means let me navigate around my document, just scroll through it, and therefore I know if I click on my image, I'm not going to actually make a change to it, whereas some of the other tools I might mess up my picture. So to just get out of the crop tool, I'm going to click on the hand. There we go. Now, if you've ever cropped a picture and you decided you didn't want to, the client came in and told you they didn't like it, just go to the crop icon. If you click on it again, it'll bring you back to that view where you can see the rest of the picture. You could adjust the cropping just as if you never finished it. Or click and hold on the crop tool, and you're going to find a choice in there called clear crop. And that would bring you back to the uncropped original. And Camera Raw never throws away the information that's been cropped out. You could open this image 30 years later and get back that stuff, as long as you have the original RAW file. Once you open it into Photoshop, meaning I go beyond this dialog box, and it's in Photoshop, then what's in Photoshop no longer has that information that's been cropped out. But if you went back to the original RAW file and you opened it in Camera Raw, it'd still be in there. Now when I'm done, in the lower right corner we have 3 buttons. Cancel means I screwed up so bad I don't want to remember any of what I've done here. So that means just get rid of what I've done. Done is equivalent to the Save button. Okay? It means save these changes. But it says done because with a RAW file, what happens is all the changes we make in Camera Raw are saved as only text that's attached to your picture, just like your shutter speed, your aperture setting, your camera model, and the date are all attached to your picture. Well, these get attached to your picture in the same way. It just adds text that says crop in the width and height of the crop, the angle it was at, and so on. It doesn't actually change the information in the file. It simply adds instructions to the file that mean the next time I open it, load these settings back in so that they can be applied again. So instead of saying save, which usually means actually physically change what's in that file, done means just attach this as text to the picture. And that's really nice because that means every single thing we ever do in Camera Raw is undoable. It's not permanent, it's just text attached to the picture. Then we have one other button down there. It's called Open Image. And Open Image means I'm done processing it here, and I will save these changes as text on the picture. But I also want to continue working on it in Photoshop. And so it would actually open it all the way into Photoshop. Camera Raw is not considered to be actually in Photoshop. We're in a plugin, a little kind of, it's kind of like being in Bridge. You're in a separate thing. So I'm going to hit the Done button. And I'll go back to Bridge. All right, now let's start processing some other images. So far all we've done is crop. Let's work on some bad images. Look at this thing. It looks like one of those images you'd rate it a 0. Like it would be a not even keep and ignore. This would be a throwaway image. But if you learn what Camera Raw is really capable of, you're going to find that you have the throwaway images you have are your fault from how you captured as far as it being blurry or being a bad composition or something else. If you captured it just some of the info, you're probably going to be able to pull something out of it. You'll be amazed. So let's take a look. On the right side, we got a bunch of sliders. And let's look at the ones that primarily deal with overall brightness. There are three main sliders you need to know about. The first one is exposure. Exposure affects the entire picture. If you want the entire picture to get brighter or darker, exposure is where you want to go. So in this case, with the exception of the sky, I want the entire picture to get brighter or darker. And the way I think about it is if 80% plus of the image needs the change, I think of it as the whole image. So I'll take exposure. And with all of these sliders, if you move them to the right, you'll usually brighten them. If you move them to the left, you darken. And it gives you a preview of that by looking at the slider, and that the slider is brighter on this end of it and is darker on that. So I'm just going to grab this, move it towards the right, keep moving it towards the right, and see what I can get. Now, if this is a JPEG file, I'd get nowhere near this much. Why? Because a JPEG file only saves enough so the image can look okay as is on screen and could be printed. And in fact, what happens is it saves a total of about 250 brightness levels. Between whatever's black and whatever's white in the picture, it's got about 250 shades in there. With a RAW file, you usually have thousands of shades between black and white. So when you move it up, there's a lot more in there to show up. It looks smoother. So that's exposure. But now I'm not happy with the sky. So we have two other sliders we want to get used to, and those are highlights and shadows. With highlights and shadows, instead of working on the entire picture, we're going to try to isolate only the bright areas with highlights, or only the dark areas with shadows. So in this case, when I look at the picture, what I don't like about it is the bright areas. I don't like that I can't see any detail in the sky, and the waterfall might also be solid white. So I'm going to grab the highlights slider, because highlights are considered the bright areas. With all these sliders, if you move it to the right, you brighten those areas. Move it to the left, you darken them. So I'll grab the highlights slider, I'll move it to the left, and I might have to move it quite a distance. But you see how I'm starting to get my sky back. Now there's only so far you can move these sliders. I've maxed out my highlights slider. Not that I wanted to cover it right now, but I'll do it anyway. That is, if you ever max out one of these sliders, this is more of an intermediate instead of a beginning idea, but if you ever max out the highlights or the shadows slider and you wish you could move it further, here's how you can get away with that. So I've already maxed out my highlights slider. And here's a trick for getting the equivalent to moving it beyond 100. Go to the exposure slider. Move it the same direction you were trying to move, the one that you maxed out. So I maxed out the highlights slider. I moved it all the way to the left. I wish I could move it further to the left. So move the exposure slider towards the left until your highlights are the way you want. Maybe about there for my sky. But that's not enough because now everything else is too dark. So to compensate for darkening everything, now go to shadows and boost it. Bring it the opposite direction you moved exposure. And you'll be able to fix it. That's more of an intermediate idea, so if that didn't connect with your head as far as the way I trick things around, don't worry. We'll do this on a lot of images. You'll get used to it. For now, think of exposure as meaning brightness for everything. Highlights as meaning brightness for the bright stuff. Shadows as meaning brightness for the dark stuff. What we happened to do is we maxed out our highlights, got it as dark as we possibly could, couldn't move it any further. So we said, fine, let's darken the entire picture by moving exposure. In doing so, the dark stuff got too dark. So we went to shadows and said, okay, let's tweak those. That's a trick. But let's look at before and after. If you want to see before and after, there are some icons in the lower right. There are 4 icons. If we have time, we'll get into all 4. But for now, let's use the one on the right. Now, when it comes to icons aren't always obvious in what they do. If it's not obvious what something does, especially when it's an icon, hover over it without clicking on it. So what do I mean by that? I just mean move your mouse on top of it and don't click. So if I do that, this will give me a tooltip. It'll tell me, what is it? Toggle between current settings and defaults. It said for visible panel only. You don't know what that means yet, but this just means when I click on it, show me the default settings. So there's my defaults. I'll click on it once more. Here's what I've done. Isn't that pretty amazing? I think it is, considering what we started with. Now I do got to make a comment though. Don't take from this that every single picture you took in the last 10 years that are dark, you're going to be able to fix. Because the one thing about your camera is it's best at capturing bright information. In the bright information, it's got nice clean data. And as it gets into the darker and darker areas, two things happen. It captures less information. So that if in the bright part of your image, in a particular brightness range, it would give you 100 brightness levels. In the same difference in brightness, same range, but in the dark part of your picture, it would give you fewer shades. It captures less and less and less information as it gets into the darker part of your picture. But the other thing is, as it gets into the darker part of your picture, it gets noisy. Usually you don't notice the noise because it's where the image looks black for the most part. And it's only when you brighten it up so that part of the picture looks normal that you've made the noise obvious. It's not that you created the noise. The noise was there. It was just so dark you couldn't see it. You made it bright so now you can see it. So in the upper left we have two tools. We have the hand tool, which allows us to scroll around our document, just click and drag, and you could move around it if we were zoomed up on it. And we have the zoom tool. And so if I use the zoom tool, I can click, and if I zoom up in the dark part of the picture, it's most likely going to look a little less than ideal in those dark areas. Don't know if you can notice it, but I notice noise in here. And also I notice that the color looks like it's blotchy. And we'll learn how to fix some of that. You can see quite a bit of it in here. But we would have to at least make sure to adjust that. Anytime we brighten up an area that was overly dark to begin with, because you're going to start seeing noise. Now, another thing to learn in here, this is true in Photoshop and in most other Adobe products, is we have a zoom tool and a hand tool up here. And if you double click on them, they have extra functions. So I'm going to double click on the hand tool. Double clicking on the hand tool brings you to fit in window view. That means show me all my picture. Double clicking on the zoom tool, on the other hand, brings you to 100% view. 100% view means show me the exact information I have in this file. Meaning zoom up until I can see the individual specks that make up the picture. You know that when you're here, even if you got your eyes really, really close to your screen, you wouldn't be able to see more and more detail because this screen, my computer screen, is only capable of showing so much. Well, when you double click on the zoom tool, it means zoom up until a speck on my picture is the same size as the smallest speck on my screen, meaning the size where it can show me every little detail. And that's where you can inspect your image. But double clicking on the hand tool and the zoom tool gives you those two different views very quickly. So you double click on hand tool, it means fit in window. Double click on zoom tool, 100% view. And so it's a nice quick way of switching between the two. Same is true in Photoshop. You'll have the hand tool and the zoom tool in your toolbar. And many other Adobe products. Double click on those things. Yeah, just going to click done. Want to show just one other issue, and that is simply when you're done adjusting or cropping a picture and you look at it in Bridge, you can tell which pictures you've adjusted and which you haven't. Do you see these little round circles in the upper right corner? If you see one that looks like this one, that means you cropped the picture. If you see one that looks like this one, you've adjusted it. You will sometimes see more than one icon. You could see both the crop icon and the adjustment icon, that type of thing. And then if you look at other images, you'll find they don't have those icons, which means you have never adjusted them or cropped them. And so therefore, if we had an image or a folder full of images, we've rated them with stars, and we filtered down to viewing only those images that are 3 stars or above, we can glance very quickly to see which ones have we worked on and which ones haven't we. Okay? So that's just a last little idea.